Renee is hiking to see the bristlecone pines in the White Mountains. So she's going to try to join us, but I doubt it. And tonight we have the pleasure of having Eric Schrader. He is from San Francisco, and he's going to be discussing raft style plantings and a little bit of bio that I got from his website. He's definitely a bonsai artist, grower, photographer, and teacher. He grew up in Boonville, California, amongst the redwoods, oaks, and the buckeye trees. His interest in bonsai has led him to explore the mountains of California, Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, and Utah in search of the wild and wonderful trees. Bonsai is an avenue for exploration of the natural world around us, as well as an art form that captures the essence of trees. He also, from what I've seen, makes some amazing bonsai stands, very unique. And tonight we're going to get to enjoy Eric's presentation on the raft style of bonsai. I'm going to highlight him, spotlight him, and then if everybody would mute themselves. If you want to ask a question, you can either type it in the chat if you'd like, or when an appropriate time would come, then you can simply ask your question, unmute yourself and ask your question. So I'm going to ask you to mute yourself because it's easier than me doing it the other way. It's harder to undo. So, Eric?
So
I'll spotlight your computer when you're ready.
Okay. So thank you for the welcome, and I appreciate you guys inviting me to do a presentation for you. Like Dodie said, I've been doing bonsai for a while now, and I grew up in Boonville. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Boonville. It's on the north coast near Mendocino, and really, you know, as a teenager, you do not appreciate the beauty of a place like that. And having gone off to college on the East Coast and then come back, I moved back in with my mom briefly for about, I don't know, 2-3 months or something like that while I was looking for a place here in the city. And I really appreciated the natural environment in Boonville, but I wasn't yet into bonsai. That didn't happen until I was living here in San Francisco and saw a show at the Cow Palace. And if any of you know Tim Kong, I think he's actually the one that that hooked me into bonsai. He had a display with a really beautiful redwood. Getting a little bit of feedback there. Hopefully that's not going to continue. So ever since I've started, I've been really interested in raft style. And for me, I think part of it is the challenge of creating this type of plant. So you can't just go dig up a raft style plant like you can an informal upright, sort of a Yamadori out of the mountains. You're not going to really find any raft style. So it really comes down to the artistry of the person that's creating it. So I have a presentation that I want to share. Dodie, go ahead and highlight the laptop and let me know when you can see it. Oops. So if everyone wants to mute themselves, I'm not sure what the feedback is.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's not.
Yeah. Can everybody mute themselves, please? Or I can do it for you.
Okay. So, so I met Kathleen and Dodie a couple years ago at the ABAS show, and I was exhibiting this 5-trunked native white pine. It's a Western white pine, Pinus monticola. And I built this, whether you want to call it a surfboard or a kayak or a raft, I built this as a sort of way to display the tree. And during the show, it was exhibited in a stand that was constructed similar to a boat trailer, but out of wood. And it was suspended by some ropes. And you can see the ropes in that photo, 1 off the front and 2 off the back, to kind of suspend it in the air like it was floating. And I think that display might be part of the reason why I'm talking to you tonight. But I also later took that because it was intended to be a actual water-worthy, if not sea-worthy, device and I floated it in the bay here and took some pictures, and so that's what you're looking at right now.
We're not seeing anything.
You're not seeing the tree?
No,
Oh, okay. Hold on one second.
we didn't actually see.
There we go. How about that?
Yeah, he knows how to do it. There, okay. We didn't see that prior one either. You had one.
All right, so everyone can see the raft, the tree floating on the water now?
Mm-hmm.
All right, good. So that's what I was just going on and on about. But, you know, this is actually probably not, in the technical sense, a raft-style bonsai. So white pines are known for being grown from seed and usually wouldn't lend themselves well to being a raft. And often because the seeds are put in the ground in a particular place by birds, they grow in clumps like this. So I suspect that this is actually at least 2, if not 5 different trees that have grown together from seeds, most likely from the same parent or similar parents in the same area. It was, not to belabor it, but it was, I believe, collected in about 1980 somewhere in Oregon, if I'm to believe John Boyce, who I purchased it from about 15 years ago. So rafts, when we talk about rafts, obviously we're not talking about watercraft. This was sort of just a joke. And see if I can go to the next slide here. So I just want to, like, it might be obvious to some of you, and it might not be obvious to you guys what a raft is, what a raft style bonsai is. So it is sort of a sub-style or genre of tree. It's not really one of the main styles of bonsai, like informal upright, formal upright, slant style. Those styles apply to many different things. And raft is really, you can make I don't think you can really make a formal upright raft, although you could give it a shot. Was that a question or someone unmuted? All right. So, but you can certainly make a slant style, which is sort of what I'm leaning on here, raft or cascades even, and other styles. Well, I would say that typically there are at least 3 trunks to a raft, and you could kind of have 2, but in essence, the portion of the raft that really makes it a raft is something that maybe is a fallen trunk or a branch that is rooted. And so usually that would end up producing more than just one extra trunk. So let me go to the next slide here. So, I went one too far, but we can address both of these at the same time. So I like to open it up to questions and sort of pepper you guys with questions. So I've been growing rafts for a long time, but I don't know how many of you have. If you have, great. If not, in your imagination, what special challenges do you think that raft style compositions create? Anyone who has an answer, please unmute yourself and pipe in.
First off, I see that someone's asking permission to record this, Robert Foster. And I think Dodie is already recording this. I don't know. I thought maybe I better bring this up.
I am. Is it okay? I'm going to post it on our website.
Yeah, so I think
Recording.
doing that, ABAS is recording it, Robert. So I don't think we necessarily want everyone recording it themselves, do we?
Right. So we'll have it on the website.
Okay. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. So if nobody wants to answer, I'll answer my own question. So I think, you know, if I take the example that I'm leaning on here, I don't know if you guys can see it very well because it's probably a tiny little thumbnail right now. But some of the challenges that rafts create is just that you are similar to a forest. You're dealing with a composition that has different trunks. And the distinction between a forest and a raft being that you're dealing with one plant in a raft and multiple plants in a forest. So with a raft, you're not going to have the types of problems you have in forests, such as like a particular individual tree getting weak, because you have a common root system, at least to start. You most likely will see common changes in all of the entire composition at once, rather than seeing individual trunks struggling. Now, light can be a problem. If you have something that is shading out something below it, then you can start to see weaker growth on the bottom, just like you would on any other type of bonsai. Now, let me move on to my second question that I have here on the slide. What do you think a raft can do that other trees can't?
What can it do? You can verify that all the trees are the same.
We're gonna genetically test them to ensure uniformity. Actually, that might not even work, because junipers are usually propagated by cuttings, so the genetics would be the same. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know that I've posed similar questions when it comes to different styles like exposed root, and sometimes a particular style has some challenges and benefits that make it either easier or more difficult to grow, either to create or maintain. And with raft, I think because you have a set of roots that's the original set of roots, and in the case of the one that I am touching right now, the original set of roots is here next to me, and then as I go further away in the box, the roots are newer. One of the benefits would be that if there's some sort of problem with the original roots, the plant is not going to be relying entirely on just the original root ball that was created prior to all of the rest of the trunks being grown. Now, the flow of sap from a particular set of roots to any given point on this tree, as you can imagine if you've dealt with junipers in the past, is going to be different for a juniper, say, than for a deciduous tree. But one of the really interesting things about rafts is the root formation of sort of almost like forming a separate tree by layering. And we'll get into that a little bit more here in a minute. But one of the benefits that I could imagine is that if you have a problem with a particular root, that the roots on the raft can compensate for that. And that wouldn't be uniform across all species, obviously. Juniper being a little bit more difficult for that to happen than something like a couple of the other trees that I have here that are off camera, hornbeam being one of them. Any questions so far?
No.
I can see a couple people scratching their heads, but nobody raising their hand. All right, I'll keep going.
I'm sorry. I wonder if Dodie could. Oh, no, you can't. Never mind. I wanted to see the whole tree, the spotlight, your whole tree. What I see is your PowerPoint questions right now.
Yeah, hold on one second.
Let's go on with your question.
Well, let me pause the.
I can spotlight it. You want me to do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's going to be from your phone.
Okay, so you can see that there's, well, this is kind of an interesting experience to try to watch myself on the laptop and point at things so that you can see them on my phone. You can see that there's a number of trunks, and let me rotate it here so that the original part of the raft is closer to the phone so you guys can see it. So this is the main trunk. The foliage on the main crown here kind of comes forward in the composition, but the trunk traces its way back down to the base that's right here. And I actually propagated this, sorry, I did not propagate this. It was about this big when I got it, and it was like a 4-inch width juniper. So this is the original root base right here. I hope you guys can see that relatively well on the phone camera. You can see there's some older, larger roots here, which I can kind of
Oh, I have to check.
sort of show you on my laptop. Can you guys see that?
Mhm.
So there are some older, larger roots here that have been formed in the last number of years. But this was the original root base of the tree. And what I did was I took the original trunk and laid it over here. So this is the original trunk. And then this, what is now the main trunk, is actually one of the original side branches. But it was a pretty bushy plant. So put that back down.
I got you back on the phone.
Excellent.
Eric, do you have any of the photos from when you first started this thing?
You know, I have another sequence that we're going to go through in the slideshow, but I do not have the sequence for this. So I will be working on the tree that we're going to show as the sequence in the slideshow, though. So let's get back to that. So
You went back to the presentation?
yeah,
Okay. So you have to share it again.
oops. My bad. There we go. All right, can you see it?
Yep.
All right, so I'll ask you guys if anyone wants to pipe in and tell me about their favorite raft style bonsai, whether that's a specimen or something that you're working on yourself. Anyone want to share?
I don't know. I don't have one.
Anyone
I don't have one either.
No?
Have one.
Oh, you're missing out.
We've had one a long time. It's an azalea, so it really looks huge. And then I've made a few, but back to your first question about some of the challenges is as I see, is finding a pot to start it with, and then after you develop it, is buying another pot that would fit it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right.
Starting and finding the right, like you had to make a box, or is finding the pot to start it in when you lay it down is a challenge. Yeah. And the root ball that is up high.
Yeah, I sort of plan to put this one in a probably on a slab. It seems appropriate for a slab, but I could certainly see how not all rafts are going to do well on a slab, and I could imagine azalea being certainly a problematic species to try to put on a slab, given that the roots are relatively sensitive to drying out. But yeah, so it's been about 15 years since I started this, and it has been in a box that entire time. It went from a little box to a bigger box to a bigger box to a bigger box. Let me just go to the next slide here. So I'm going to come back to the other example here in a minute. So I like to kind of like paint the boundaries of what we're calling a raft. And this is not me making a rule. This is me just sort of wanting to get you guys thinking a little bit about what is a raft and what isn't. So with thanks to a particular Reddit user, and if anyone wants to find this, they can Google it, or I can share the credit afterwards. This is a tree, obviously, that's partially fallen over and now has grown 5 additional trunks that were presumably previously branches on the original trunk. And I find this kind of thing fascinating. I don't think that this particular example is incredibly attractive, if only because I don't like the angles that much. But it is an example of a raft happening in nature, the same sort of process that we're going to be going through here in the example that I'm going to be talking about. So it's interesting to see that. I've seen similar examples, which I couldn't find photos of in my archive, of bay trees in Marin County. So during storms, they'll get knocked over and part of the roots will be ripped out of the ground, but other parts of the roots will stay in the ground. And I've seen them span small gullies or canyons where there are then roots on one side and the top of the tree laying on the other side with trunks going up into the air across the canyon. Kind of an interesting composition. So this is very similar to to the previous slide, and this is a raft that was created by Harry Harrington in England. He has the website Bonsai for Me, which many people are familiar with because he has a lot of really great articles on there. So this is a hawthorn, and he has basically taken it, and the trunk has been broken off. I'm not sure whether he did that on purpose and carved it, or whether that was as a result of something that happened during collecting. But you can see that it's similar in style to the natural tree that we were just looking at in the previous example. Now, the reason I have a question mark here is that, is this a raft? I'm actually not sure it is a raft. My criteria for raft, and if you Google raft bonsai, this is one of the things that will come up. But my criteria for raft is that the trunk has fallen over, and not only has it grown new trunks upward from the original trunk, it is also rooted from that original trunk into the ground. So maybe I'm being a little bit too strict with my interpretation, but I think the stricter interpretation of requiring there to be additional roots away from the original root ball allows the bonsai artist to create a little bit more interest in the composition. Any thoughts or questions on that line of thinking?
My immediate response when you asked if it was a raft, I didn't think it would be because it wasn't laying down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that too.
I suppose. So it's always, I find it interesting to sort of like make a distinction between, you know, styles like this to try to figure out, well, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about a particular style? So I wouldn't kick this out of a show, but I'm not sure I would call it a raft either. All right, moving on here. So you can see at the top photo there on the slide is obviously the same tree that I have next to me, and then the bottom photo is a hornbeam, and we'll come back to that one in a little while. I've had experience with creating rafts out of a number of species. Maples, hornbeams. I made a small elm raft, and basically my conclusion has been that you can make a raft out of pretty much anything that you could air layer. That doesn't necessarily include anything. So if you can air layer it, you should be able to also make cuttings out of it. But the air layering seems to be a more accurate representation. For example, I have never had success with taking cuttings from a hornbeam, but I have had success with air layering them. So basically what you're looking for is the ability of the plant to root in some fashion along the stem. And black pine being my counterexample here, I know people air layer them. I've never done it myself, and I know that it's pretty difficult under some circumstances you can, and I often think to myself, well, why would I when I can grow them from seed very easily? But I can't say that I've ever seen a black pine raft, even a picture of a black pine raft. On the other hand, white pine rafts are relatively common in shows in Japan. I shouldn't say common, but they are certainly in existence. And then anything like crab apples and quince, you can use the suckers that come out the side and sort of lay them down to start creating something like a raft. But you would have to be sort of diligent about not just letting it spread in all directions, creating some sort of directionality instead of just a extended clump. Anyone have any thoughts they want to share on that? We'll move on to the... Okay, so that skipped a slide. Let me go back here. There we go. So back in, I believe it was about 2010, I bought this little hornbeam from Lone Pine. I think it was a 4-inch whip. And I grew it in a bonsai pot for a number of years. This was long enough ago that I'm not sure I really knew what I was doing in terms of creating good roots. When I had it in a round container, and when I pulled it out of the round container to do a repotting, I noted this root formation that you can see on the left side of that photo, which was basically that there were no roots on one side. And I kind of looked at the root ball and thought to myself, well, I wonder what I should do about this. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll just lean it over, face all the roots downward, and see what happens if I try to turn it into a raft. You can see a piece of black plastic there, which I used to raise the soil level on the left side a little bit initially when I planted it in this box. But the idea here was to basically cut all the branches off of one side, as you would expect, lay it down and anchor it in the soil, add some rooting hormone along the cuts, and then kind of see what happens. And you can see on the right side that there are some smaller branches that reach almost all the way over to the right side of the box. And that being a mostly overhead view. So then a year later, actually I think it was more like a year and a half later, this is what I had. I had basically just let all of the shoots grow rapidly from that tree. And we're gonna be a little bit disoriented here because I think I'm flopping left, right in shooting these photos when I was shooting them a long time ago. But in any case, the idea here was to just let all of those shoots run and then wire them all. So what I did was I selected some of the shoots that had run, removed them, and kept others, and wired all the ones that I kept up to basically as far as I thought I would need to use in the final composition. The key things here being that I was looking to create a multi-trunk composition, and I wanted to ensure that most of the trunks went together. Now, based on what we saw earlier, can anyone guess what I did next? I planted it in the ground actually in my front yard here in San Francisco. I have about 100 square feet worth of ground growing space, if you can believe it. It's like acreage for San Francisco. Oops, let me go back here. So this was at the end of 2019. So in early 2019, I dug up this plant and I was concerned about, I had put a board under it, but I was still concerned about the number of roots that I had to cut. So I just sort of let it run after doing just like a rough cutback during the extraction from the ground phase. And you can see that all of those trunks that I wired have now gotten quite a bit bigger. But I didn't cut it back far enough, essentially. So I wasn't happy with where the tree had budded out in this particular case. And so I decided that I was going to remove all of this upper growth that we have here that came out in that first year in the box and just cut it back to lower down. The reason being basically that, so these two photos are flopped right, left. But I felt there were too many straight sections above the original wired sections that would be included in the composition if I kept the growth that happened in that first year out of the ground. And the mistake I made was that I really should have cut back this far at the same time that I extracted the plant from the ground. So the overall process here is basically to take a young plant, do a rough cutback, and change the orientation. You're going to want to plant it ideally in such a way that you have most of the branches going up. If you already have branching, you can wire those branches all together at the same time. Keep an eye on the wire if you're going to let it run. And then you're going to let it run for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. The juniper has taken, like I said earlier, about 15 years to get to the point it is right now. That was entirely in a container, not ground grown. And then you're going to be doing trunk shaping and trying to improve the bulk of the wood for a number of years. And these are sort of estimates. They would be varying depending on the species that you're using. And then later in the process, you're going to be doing refinement, where you are actually creating the finished branching, which is what I had hoped to do when I took all the leaves off last fall, and then realized that I needed to cut the trunks back further in this case. So I kind of sped through that. Do you guys have any questions about that particular example?
Can you go back to the screen slide before that? Yeah, this is my novice here, but the branch on the far right, you didn't wire it as far as the others. Why was that?
Yeah, so I think my thinking then, and I think you can probably see it again later, which in this case is on the left, is that I wanted to create a shorter trunk on the outside of the composition. So I wasn't concerned about what the movement of the trunk would be beyond that point. Really what I was looking for was just the bottom, say, I'm going to estimate about 12 inches of that trunk that I was going to be keeping, and I was not concerned. I was leaving the rest of the growth just as a sacrifice branch to drive the wood production for that particular trunk. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would say that if you're going to be creating rafts, that you're going to be going into one of my, favorite things, which is more of the growing aspects of bonsai instead of just the refinement aspects. I think that's one of the reasons I find rafts to be kind of fascinating, is because you really can't get away from that. So that the presence of that sacrifice branch is really part of the growing process, and you wouldn't obviously be leaving a large branch like that if you were trying to create refinement. Okay, so I mentioned a couple of these before, but I think the aesthetic considerations are important to discuss, at least briefly. My principal interest in rafts comes from the interest that they create in the nabari. And in the case of this juniper, I showed you a little bit of the trunk or the root character here. Rootage is not typically considered to be something that's really important for juniper bonsai because a lot of the rootage is rots away when there are shari that form. So Yamadori junipers very frequently don't have very good rootage on them. If you look at large Sierra junipers up in the Sierra, not the battered windswept small ones that people tend to collect for purposes of making into bonsai, but the larger sort of grand specimens, like the Bennett juniper being the grand champion, they actually do have very even rootage, very nice nabari that would be considered very classical, just like a pine tree in most bonsai. So I think the roots are one of the more interesting things, and we'll take a look at the rootage on the example I just showed you after the break. As I mentioned in the progression, you want to make sure that you're harmonizing the trunks. So in the case of this composition, everything is going off to my right, and it is a very wind influenced composition. You can see that as I rotate it here, let's just briefly, Dodie, can you highlight my phone? You're on mute. Well, anyway, so the trunks are all generally tending in the same direction, and thank you. They're generally tending in the same direction, and you can see that back here where there's some light coming through, you can see the trunk lines are all headed initially kind of steeply upward with the main trunk here, and then progressively flatter and flatter as we look at the trunks like these guys in the back, or even like this one right here. It basically, the trunk starts all the way back, let's see, right here. You see my finger? So that trunk runs all the way over to that crown. So there's a very wind influenced sort of aesthetic to this particular planting. The other thing that Jonas and I talk about these kinds of things sometimes, sort of nerding out about bonsai, and him and most, I think, other people who see this in person object to this crown being so far forward of the main crown. So if this is the main crown and this crown is sticking forward, you can see that it's kind of coming right at you, especially from the front of the box. It's also sort of blocking the view a little bit of some of the other crowns. So despite having spent 15 years working on this, it's not perfect. And I haven't figured out whether I want to, I've often thought that I'm going to take, not that one, I'm going to take this crown out to create a little bit more space in there. So back to my presentation, the next point, thank you. The next 2 points really are sort of what I was just talking about. Think about the natural shading that the tree.
Can you share it?
Oops. I guess it kicks you out from sharing it when you change the screen. Okay. So the natural shading that the tree might create as a result of the multi-trunk scenario that you're creating is something that you need to take into account. So with the hornbeam raft that I was showing you in the photos earlier in the presentation, I've created a structure that goes outward. Essentially, the trunks that are more, got soil on my arm, the trunks that are in the middle are going more upward, and the trunks that are on the outside are going more outward like this. That has to do with light. Essentially, when you have a clump, in that sort of scenario, the trees are naturally going to spread apart like that. So I'm imitating that natural sort of seeking out of light. So consider the natural shading. And that's also why I'm talking about how maybe the trunks on this tree are a little bit too close together, because you can see how maybe naturally the crowns that are here at the top would be shading out the crowns that are lower down and all of the interior branching. So when you're creating the composition, if you're creating it from scratch like this, you should be taking that into account. And to that point, removing extraneous branching, and I believe that I'm still arriving at the right amount of branching for this composition. With the deciduous tree, it wouldn't be quite the same scenario, but with the juniper, you can see that despite the complexity of the trunk lines and the interplay of the trunks, that because there are so many trunks in this composition, you would want to simplify the branching that is on each trunk and make sure that you don't have branches crossing trunks, you don't have trunks crossing trunks, and that there's enough space between the branches to actually allow you to appreciate each one of the levels in the composition. I hope that makes sense to everyone. And the last point would be to stay true to your species. This, I will say, contradicts that point in some ways. I can imagine a juniper looking like this, but in all of the hiking and exploration that I've done in mountainous areas, I don't think I've ever seen one that looks quite like this. But what I have seen that looks like this are whitebark pines, for example. Very common to see them in a scenario like this, very windswept, kind of clumpy looking. And I think that it's important to remember the species that you're working with, but you can also sort of break the rules. So I'm not telling you the only thing you can do. Any questions about those aesthetic considerations? A lot of that's really sort of opinion. Some of it harkens to the rules of bonsai, so to speak, but rules are meant to be broken in my book. Learn them and then forget them. Okay, So we're going to take a break. I think you guys are going to have a short business meeting. Before we do that, I just want to mention two things. One is I have a new website. It's bonsai.com. If you guys haven't seen that in one of my emails or follow me on Instagram, I'd encourage you to check it out. I have some pots and trees listed on there right now. There's going to be other stuff in the future. You can check out some of my work on Instagram at Eric Schrader Bonsai. And then for tonight, I would encourage you guys all to consider donating the amount of money that you would have spent driving to this meeting if you had gone there in person to ABAS. And I'm going to copy this link here if I can. And I'll put it in the chat. You guys can follow this. This is a form that that you can use to make a one-time donation to the club. There you go.
That's very kind of you.
So that's in the chat. Now, to incentivize you, I believe there's I'm not sure whether it's a door prize or not. I'm running a workshop on creating exposed root black pine at the beginning of December. And whoever wins the raffle, I'm going to mail you this plant. You're going to get to participate in that workshop. It's a remote workshop, so it'll be run over Zoom, just like this meeting's being run. But you will have this plant in hand if you win the raffle. And good luck, and I will ship it to you. So make sure if you do win that you provide Dodie with your mailing address.
That's wonderful.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you, Eric. That's great. So we're going to take a short, have a short business meeting, about 10, 15 minutes at max, and then Eric's going to continue on with his wonderful program. So I guess.
Hey, before we go on to that, Eric, I just wanted to comment on your I don't know if you can hear me, but your logo is really fascinating. From a distance, I just thought it was like a hummingbird. And then when you were closer, you could see that it was two leaves that kind of shaped that. It's very clever, that kind of way that things kind of flop, where you're looking at something one way and then you see, you know, the other image. Beautiful.
Yeah, I wish I could take credit for that myself, but I hired a designer who I've known for a very long time, and she came up with it. And I call them double entendre logos.
Mm-hmm.
I love double entendre logos. So you can see it on my shirt if I can get it.
Yeah.
It's a hummingbird, but it's also two leaves.
Yes.
That's wonderful.
Exactly.
That's great. That's great. Excellent. Okie dokie. I'm going to stop your screen share so you can have a breather. Let's see how to do this. Where's the problem?
Then you have a little agenda for our meeting, Dodie, is that right?
I do.
Okay.
Trying to, not that y'all need to.
So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take just a sharp knife here. This is, I use this mostly for creating shari on junipers, but it'll work just as well for making a few cuts in the bark. I'm just going to expose the cambium layer to some moisture here, and I'm going to add a little bit of rooting hormone, which is what I was grabbing a minute ago. So let's see here. I don't want to hold it over my laptop, but you guys can kind of see those scrapes of bark that I've taken off there.
Yep.
All right, and I have some, this is Hormex rooting powder number 3, which means that it has 3,000 parts per million of indobutyric acid, one of the hormones that's used commonly for getting plants to root where you want them to. These Hormex comes in, I believe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, and 16. And those are different concentrations. Different types of plants, you want to use different rooting hormones, generally speaking. But if you don't want to go to all the trouble of having different rooting hormones, just pick one and see how it does for you. I find that I use number 8 on junipers, and I use number 3 on some of the deciduous material that I work with, which is not a uniform rule. Deciduous can be very difficult to root. In fact, a friend of mine, while we're talking about rooting, a friend of mine brought me a particular variety of Japanese maple that I had never seen before. It has a tiny red leaf, and the leaf stays red all year round. Well, not all year round, obviously, but for the whole growing season, it stays red. And I think it was called Aratama, and everyone's like, you mean Arakawa? And no, Aratama. But anyway, I tried a variety of different rooting hormones because I didn't want to graft them, and had very little success in getting it to root, unfortunately, but I did get a few. Okay, so I've gone ahead and added just a little bit of rooting hormone to that, and I'm going to lay that down into the soil that I have here. You really can use pretty much any box, bonsai pot, anything that's a suitable size. You just want to have enough space so that you can fit your raft. One thing I would say is that, so here I'm going corner to corner on a square container. I've got the roots not right up in the corner, but with not a whole lot of space here. And then I've got the growing tip, the outermost tip here, a few inches away from the end. That gives me the option to bend this down more if I decide that I want the raft to be longer while it's still flexible. And I'm going to show you an example of a juniper where I've done something similar. But give yourself a little bit of extra room, because you might change your mind about, depending on what sprouts out here, or how this grows, or how that grows, or what happens over here with something this young, you might change the plan. And if you have to change the container because you put it in a container that's only just as big as what you were originally thinking, you might end up losing time. You're probably not going to really have any major problems unless you do it out of season ill-advisedly. But if you put it in a larger container than it really needs, it gives you a little bit more option to sort of adapt to what the plant is doing. So I'm actually not using bonsai soil here. This is mostly perlite. When I do young plants, I'll frequently not use bonsai soil just because of the cost. And so I've covered the original roots on this side, and I am going to add enough soil so that the entire raft section is buried. I don't want to leave that exposed. I want to keep it wet so that it has, just like you were doing a cutting or an air layer, you want to give it as much chance to form roots as you can. So now it sort of looks like two trees in a pot, and the raft is spanning those two underneath the soil. Okay, so that's kind of step one that we talked about in the presentation. We've taken the plant that was upright, laid it over, added some movement to it, and just sort of started it on its way. And at this point, we just need to water, fertilize, give it lots of sun. So that's kind of the end of step one. You would probably come back to this in maybe about a year, but if it's growing really quickly, maybe sooner than that to revisit some of the new growth. Anyone have any questions about this step? Five seconds of silence. I will take that as a no. All right.
Why can't I unmute? Eric, this is Dodie. I did have a question. I thought I was unmuted. With the wire on that, on the new trunk, and it's buried, it's likely going to get scarred up. But that you don't really care, I assume.
I think in some circumstances you might, and in other circumstances you wouldn't. The scarring on some species, and I would say crabapple might be one of those, could actually encourage rooting along the stem. But I would keep an eye on it. I would just sort of dig my finger down in there a little bit from time to time and just keep a watch on the wire. And it wouldn't hurt to even just rake away the majority of the soil, you know, once a month or something like that, to check that wire if you were concerned about it causing some sort of scarring or reverse taper on the trunk. I certainly would not leave the wire on there to become completely embedded in the wood of the tree.
Okay.
I've seen, there used to be a imported white pines grafted on black pine rootstock, I believe, where there was a bark pattern that was very indicative of a wire that had been left in from very young in the growing process. And I think most people who do bonsai can kind of recognize that pattern. And so I tend to avoid things that are easily recognizable as something that's sort of like, well, that looks weird, because I don't find it attractive. All right, so this is a juniper, just like my giant one, but sort of like my giant one about 12 years ago. So last winter, let me see if I can expose this so you guys can see it. Should have done that.
Is it possible to move the phone closer by chance?
Yeah, let me just get the soil out from on top of the actual raft so that you guys can actually kind of see a little bit of what I was up to last winter. Haha, perfect. It's like I planned it. So as I excavate here, basically what I'm looking at is the wired. So I just finished wiring that crabapple. Obviously this, when I wired it and laid it down in this box, was significantly bigger than that crabapple was just now. The original length was about from here to here. So I left myself a little bit of room. And actually, no, I take that back. So it came all the way out to here. These shoots are new this year, as is this. But the edge of the root ball is all the way over here, and the tip of the old growth is only about 2 inches from the end of the pot on this end. All right, let me quickly, a second. Let me just put this down.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Okay. So over here, kind of right next to this little tag that I have here, is where the original root ball is. And you can see, hopefully, there's some finer soil right here and some old roots. And then we have the trunk line here. We have the trunk line right here, and you can see that there's copper wire that I've placed there. And if I dig this away, so here's that. And then this would be your first trunk that has been wired up and away from that. You can come over here now. This was a couple inches below the surface. I don't know if you guys can see it very well, but there.
Oh, it's a root.
It's not focusing.
Okay.
Yeah, right there is a nice new root. So, and that's actually on the top of the raft. So if there's one on the top, that means it's very likely that there are more on the bottom. The line of the raft goes all the way over to here and then ends up here on this clump of foliage. Back down. And I can tip this up a little bit as well. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we could hear you great.
Okay.
Eric, I have a question.
Yeah.
Why, I mean, not why, but of course, if we had an upright juniper, we would get the rapid growth at the top of the upright. This looks like that the dominant growth is still at the top, even though it's laid over. So versus, I guess my first thought would be by your white tag back there, That's where I thought the more rapid growth would have occurred.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, and actually what has happened here, I'm not going to move the phone again, but I'll tilt this up. So you'll just have to believe me when I say there's actually a small piece of wire right here that was a branch that died after I made the raft. And so the first live branch on the trunk is actually over here, about 4 or 5 inches away from the base of the tree. So I had a batch of about 30 of these that I was working with, and this is the only one that I created a raft out of. Part of the reason I selected this one was that it had a low branch here. So that has gone awry because I no longer have a branch near the original roots, which is something that I would have liked to see. So I think that branch was too weak. Now, because these were all growing upright prior to the work that I did to them last winter, and they were seedlings all clumped together, they were in shorter containers, but if you can imagine a bunch of junipers that are about the size of this container and pine, they were all clumped together, one right next to the other. And so the lower branches that are down here are getting almost no light and they're getting weak, whereas these tips that were at the top were by far the strongest part of the tree. Now, the juniper that I had up here before that was more mature, that's 15 years on from the beginning of the process. This one has a little bit of a head start from where I started on that one, because with that one, I had the roots and all the foliage over here right next to the roots. No long trunk to start with existing branches. And what I did with that one was sort of, this trunk would grow, which is why it's now the dominant trunk in that composition. And then as the shoots grew off to the side here, I would lay them down. So that would be like if I took this shoot and I laid it down into the dirt like that. And before I did that, I would scrape all the foliage off of the side that was going to be down, and I would scrape a little bit of bark off of there, add a little bit of rooting hormone, just like I did to the crabapple. And then when I lay that down, that creates the next section of that raft. So year after year, I would add to the length of the raft, and I've done that probably more than a half a dozen times with that particular composition in order to increase the size of the composition. But back to your original question, over time, I would expect that you are going to need to sort of exert some control. When I first laid this down, these being the weaker branches over here that were closer to the base and getting less light, they're going to start off more slowly. They've already got, this one in particular has already got a nice vigorous tip, which it certainly didn't have at the beginning of the year. These guys already had vigorous tips on them, so they kind of had a head start. I would say I'm not going to cut this back right now. And in fact, this fall winter, I wouldn't do any foliage reduction at this stage, because really all I'm interested in right now is getting these guys a lot taller. With a composition that's this long, I'm probably looking at a finish height that's at least here. It could certainly be even taller. So I want to let all of these runners go to start to create that height and those trunks. There's an element of randomness, I think, in it that is maybe part of the reason that I find it so interesting. Because I would imagine, given the tree's current situation, that in this case, the raft ends up being something where the trunk that's, the original top, before it was laid over, this section remains dominant and does become one of the dominant trunks in the composition, whereas these trunks remain smaller. So that's a different type of composition than the one that I had up here as a more mature example. But you can create all kinds of different styles, and I can imagine sort of a windswept composition where these plants are being battered, the trees or trunks on this side of the plant are being battered, and so they grow more slowly, whereas this is being protected and grows more quickly because of the protection that these are providing. But I think
so it's random. It's random then that not necessarily the rule that the top, your left-hand side, is going to be dominant. It just, that's the way this one's coming out. but your right-hand side could just as easily have become dominant depending on the tree.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, I mean, you know, with the mature composition, it was the trunk that was closest to the original root base that was the strongest. And that's
Sure, on your original one.
right.
And
with
I
this
just
one,
noticed this one's so vigorous on your left-hand side. So
Right.
that was all my concern was did I need to cut, if I were doing this, did I need to cut your left-hand side back if I wanted to copy your original one? Then I need to get more vigor on your right-hand side. But then you said, okay, I could go however the tree's going to take me. I can go with that too. Hadn't thought of that.
yeah, and that's something that I would encourage you to kind of like consider it a conversation with the tree. You know, I don't know whether I think Ryan might use that term, or whether I made it up or whether I got it from somebody else. But it's not just that you are telling the tree what to do and it's going to do it. You know, you're telling the tree, okay, let's do this, and the tree's like, well, you know, I'm gonna grow over here, not over there where you were originally thinking. And I would just take that as a cue artistically to adapt your composition to something. And every time you revisit this as a composition, think to yourself, well, how can I make this more interesting? How can I adapt what I have here to make it the most interesting composition that I can create? That's usually how I'm working with a piece of material. And I think you'll find that it's the common approach. It's the most common approach for Yamadori. When you go dig up a plant that already has a large structure in place, that already has a lot of really great interest in the plant, you adapt your styling of that plant to what is already there. So you can do that with growing material from scratch as well. It's just that you're incrementally doing it. So instead of in one fell swoop, you're saying, okay, well, this is the most interesting part of the composition, and so I'm going to do this. You can look at this and say, well, you know, the original root base over here is not really that interesting. There's no foliage growth over here. So, you know, it's not time to do it yet, but I might just end up removing that part of the composition entirely. And I can do anything I want with these at this stage because they're still flexible. So I might reorient the whole thing the other direction than what I had originally oriented. And so the trunks are originally oriented this way, but we could easily reorient that direction.
That
So-
led me to my question. At what point do you wire the trunks? I assume it depends upon the species.
Yeah, so in the slides that I showed you, basically I let the hornbeam, which I have here just off camera, grow for a year, and then I wired all of those shoots, and then I put it in the ground and let it grow for another 4 or 5 years before I dug it back up and cut it back. In this case, I actually had, there's wire on the one that died. There's wire on this one right here, which is hard to see from your guys' perspective. There's a little bit of wire on here. So I was already wiring a little bit. And apart from that, it's just the main wire that's on the curve of the original portion of the raft. I tend to wire things once they've elongated enough, if I'm keeping them, but before they're too stiff to wire. So you kind of have to keep an eye on it, I guess is the answer.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I noticed that Susan has her hand up. Susan, did you have a question you want to ask?
Yeah, I was wondering if there are any special watering concerns or fertilizing concerns with this style?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So, so let me just tilt this up a little bit so you guys can see it. So the original roots being right here. When I first transplanted this, obviously all the roots in the entire composition are right here. And that's actually why I put this stake here, because I wasn't sure after I buried it and I would remember exactly where it was. And I wanted to ensure that at least, I mean, it was, I'm going to say it was like last December that I did this. at that point, it's not, watering is not as critical as it might be during the growing season. But I was very conscientious of the fact that the only roots in this entire box were going to be right here. So in the nascent stages of what you're doing, you do need to be very cognizant of the fact that you have a limited root mass, even though you have a giant container that you're working with. And the same thing is true for the small crabapple that I just did. I would be sure that I didn't just water half of this container. Sorry for all the throat clearing. So later in the life of a raft, I would say you still need to be cognizant of the fact that you have a composition with roots that might not be similar to what you have in a regular bonsai pot. You might have part of the composition relying on roots over here, part of the composition relying on roots over here. And so you really should try to make sure that you're aware of where the tree is getting the water and water appropriately. Does that answer your question?
I suspect so. That was good.
Okay.
Before you go on, may I ask a question? I would think that given the nature of that you've laid down a branch and then you have the trunk, and that you have the branches becoming the individual trees, that rafts would tend to, where, you know, just as is in a normal bonsai, the heaviest branch is the lowest branch, and that it gets progressively thinner, that you would have most often the highest part of it on one end or the other, rather than having the way that a forest would be, where your biggest, fattest tree is generally in the middle. That would be a more unusual to have the biggest, fattest one in the center of the composition with a raft. Is that true?
I think you could probably find evidence to support both sides of an argument if that was brought up in debate in nature. And I think the distinction would be that the original portion, you know, the original largest branches from the tree at the time that it fell over might initially be the largest trunk, but the scenario, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where the distribution of light changes so dramatically at the time that the trunk falls over, if that's the sort of creation of the raft that you're speaking of, that the trunks in the center might get more light, you know, the trunks in the center of a composition, and eventually as that, you know, so assuming that the tree falling over is a scenario, and you think of year 0 as the year that happened, the growth in the middle, if it gains an advantage by going straight up and start shading the growth that's on either side, regardless of whether it's the side with the original roots or the side that was originally the top, has gained that advantage. And the growth that's to either side of it will grow away from that growth. So it's the nature of each individual branch on a tree to seek out light in its own way. And obviously that's subject to the genetic expression of the plant, but plants are hardwired to seek out the brightest spot. And so if you have a trunk here and a trunk here that's slightly shorter, this trunk's going to try to go that way to get away from that trunk, because there's less light on this, there's less light, well, you get my point. There's less light on one side than the other, so it's going to lean away. So I would say a very old raft composition might have trunks in the middle that are larger, just like you would see in a forest, whereas a younger raft composition might be a different scenario.
Okay.
But I don't find these kinds of things to be things that are rules. I find them to be interesting points of discussion. just like what we're having here. And to think about scenarios where a tree may have done one thing or may have done another is a really interesting sort of thought exercise. And I think that you should engage in those thought exercises, but you also shouldn't feel confined by what would have happened in nature by your estimation, or what you can document as having happened in nature. The scenario, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long about this, but the scenario where you have the lowest branch as the largest branch is actually more of a bonsai scenario than it is a natural scenario when you're talking about deciduous plants or deciduous trees. So in something like a Sierra Juniper, you might have the lowest branch be the largest branch. But in a bonsai composition, you absolutely want the lowest branch to be the largest branch. That is not a tree thing. That is a forced perspective / mess with your brain kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nature doesn't follow rules.
Yeah, so
it does its own thing.
So I hope that answers your question in a couple different ways.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so let me set this aside. And give me a second here to get move some things around. Earlier, when Jody and I were setting things up, I told her that she might not believe it, but the Juniper was actually the smaller of the two rafts that I had to share.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
All right, so let me just give me a second to move the camera so you guys can see that whole thing.
Huh?
That's the hornbeam, isn't it?
No, it's a different one, isn't it? Or is it? Wow.
Okay. All right. So this is the same hornbeam that we were looking at in the presentation. And it looks really big because it's sitting up on a table on top of the table. If I get a tape measure out here, just to give you guys an actual measurement, the base is about 17 inches from, here, can you see that? The base is about 17 inches from side to side there. And that means that currently it's up at about 3 feet tall. But most of this is just sacrifice growth. And I was thinking I was going to, you'll be able to see me here better in a minute. I was thinking I was going to cut this back a while ago, and then I thought, oh, I'm doing a raft presentation relatively soon, so I'll save it for their entertainment. So let me grab a pair of cutters here. This is, as the leaves have not started to change on this, but I won't be expecting any more real growth on this plant for the rest of the season, given that we're almost into November. Even here in San Francisco, where winter temperatures stay quite warm compared to inland areas, it still will drop leaves by about mid to late November. About the third week of November is usually the point at which most of my deciduous material has dropped. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut back a lot of the longer shoots that I have left to go on this. Now you'll notice that this one is also in a really big box. I think I actually had this box left over from something else, and it happened to be big enough, probably a little bit deeper than it needed to be. This tree, when it was growing in the ground, was on top of a board, and you guys saw it in a much shallower box. The bottom of that original box actually was the board that it was growing on top of. So the root ball in the ground was definitely shallower than this box. But the advantage of that is definitely that it's put on some really nice growth this year, because you can see from, I hope you remember the stumps that I cut it back to last winter.
Last winter, that's 1 year's growth. That's all growth in 1 year?
It is, and I have to tell you, I was really happy and really surprised.
Wow.
Because we don't get a lot of heat in San Francisco to drive deciduous growth. So granted, when trees like this are coming out of the ground, they will tend to be significantly more vigorous for the next few years after they're taken out of the ground, assuming that extracting them from the ground doesn't cause any sort of health issues or dieback or anything like that, which in this case it did not. So I don't know, have you guys had Andrew Robson on to do a program yet?
No. What's his last name?
Robson, R-O-B-S-O-N. So Andrew is apprenticed with Mike Hagedorn, who is up in Portland. And I think he just finished his apprenticeship sometime last year, actually. It was in 2019, I think. He came and visited, and his focus is really just on deciduous material. He doesn't do as much work on conifers as a lot of other people do, which isn't to say he doesn't, but his focus is with deciduous material. And he and I actually looked at this together. He was kind of intrigued, and I was interested to have his opinion on what he would do with it after I had cut it back so harshly. And he kind of looked at it and he said something kind of interesting to me that I hadn't thought of myself, which once again reminded me that no matter how much you've studied bonsai, that you can always learn something else from someone that you wouldn't have thought of yourself. So what he said to me was, it's really interesting. It has a really nice root base. This is the original end that had the roots that I showed you in the very first picture. And then this is what was the top of the tree at the time that I started creating the raft out of it. After it went in the ground, I really didn't touch it very much. It was in my front yard, and I was not paying very close attention to it. I actually think I could have shaved some years off of what the process that I'm going through right now if I had paid a little bit closer attention to it. But c'est la vie. And what he said was, all the trunks are the same size. Now, Kathleen, that is sort of to your question that you asked a few minutes ago. And I immediately thought that I probably had thought of that very issue and not just sort of articulated it in my head. So that once he said it, I kind of thought to myself, you're absolutely correct. And he said, well, I thought, okay, so, I should just cut off some of the trunks, or maybe I would cut some of the trunks to an even lower position than I had. And he's like, no, don't worry, don't do that. Just when you get a bud at the base, let some littler trunks grow and create some smaller trunks. So you can see, hopefully here. So this is a new trunk that I'm growing from right down here. See here. So this sprout came out of there we go. So this sprout came out right here, and I just sort of left it to go. I put a little bit of wire on it to add a little bit of movement, and then I let it run to let it bulk up a little bit. Obviously, this size is still, it's got a little ways to go before I think it belongs in the composition. I'd really like to see it more like about that size compared to some of the larger trunks that are in the composition. But I think Andrew was absolutely correct in suggesting that, and I think that it has already improved this composition. Now that said, I'm not going to be keeping every little shoot that comes out of the base, because that just makes it so you can't see, so you can't appreciate all that wood that I spent all those years growing. I cannot lower this, so why don't you switch back to the other camera?
Okay.
So you can see there's a fair amount of wood here, and I want to remove some of those shoots I just cut off from this section so that I can appreciate that portion of the trunk, if that makes sense to you guys.
Mm-hmm.
And the other things I'm doing here as part of the refinement process on this particular tree are, let's see, this is a relatively large cut. I don't know if you can see it. There, yeah. So there's a relatively large cut, and then some of the other large cuts you can see are up higher in the composition, like right here. So what I'm trying to do with a lot of these really large shoots that I've left to run at or near those cuts is just sort of build the next section of the trunk. So there's not a whole lot of taper in this section from here to here, and I'd like to see that improved. I'd like to see, it's not going to be a short sort of powerful composition. Jonas has a really, I think it's a imported Korean hornbeam that has a really big base on it, and then it tapers rapidly and has a nice big full crown. So this is going to be a little bit taller composition, but what I really need to work on right now is the transitions between the field grown trunk size and the next section of the trunk here. So this is not quite large enough yet. We want this to be about 2/3 the size of this to show a more natural sort of taper, if that makes sense to you guys.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, while I am doing that, I'm going to be kind of training some of these side branches to stay compact, creating more fine branching in certain areas. One of the things I like to encourage people to do is think about what are the things that you can do simultaneously. So when you talk about growing material from scratch, a lot of people think that the horizon, the timeline from start to finish is just incredibly long. And so while that is the case with a lot of material, you know, a 10 or 15 year timeline, I don't want that 10 or 15 year timeline to turn into a 20 or 25 year timeline, because every year that you can save is one year more that you get to appreciate it more sort of as a mature composition rather than as a piece of material that you're still working on. So in working on both the small branching and working on the taper at the same time, I'm hoping to kind of shave off a few of those years that I might otherwise be spending later on building ramification, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm done with this for the session tonight, basically I'm going to have cut it back to a bunch of small branches that have a couple of nodes on them. There's not a lot of refinement. Given that it was only a year ago that it had no branches, I'm very happy with the amount of progress that I've seen this year. But I don't feel a sense of urgency, just a sort of marching along, making sure that the tree is progressing the way that it should and as quickly as possible.
Eric, I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you prevent all the trunks from being the same size? Let some run and not let others run?
Yeah, exactly. So when I planted this in the ground, I knew it was a raft, and I knew I was going to dig it back up to become a bonsai eventually. And, you know, life gets in the way sometimes. You forget, or you're like, oh, I'll get to that next week kind of thing. And 2 years later, you still haven't gotten to it. I kind of feel like that's what happened with this guy. I would have gotten down underneath. I mean, just to give you some context, I mean, for as big as this is right now, It was about, I'm going to say it was like 6 feet across and 6 feet tall, kind of size bush, towards like right before I started cutting it back to dig it out of the ground. And so it was pretty difficult to get in there and kind of like see, well, like what actually is going on under here, and what are the various trunk sizes, and where should I cut it back? So I shouldn't have let it get that far out of control. And actually kind of reminds me of a funny story. I don't know if any of you guys have been up to either Jim Gremmel's place or in Occidental, or to Evergreen Garden Works up near Clear Lake. Have you guys been up to either of those places?
I haven't.
No?
I haven't.
Okay. Well, what do you think happens when you put a bunch of trees in the ground?
They grow.
You get a forest.
Oh.
So I visited both of them at one point or another. So that's Brent Walston up in Clear Lake. I think he's actually outside of Kelseyville. And as you're driving down the driveway to get to the nursery, there's like a little forest there, and you're sort of looking at it like, oh, all the bases of those trees look really wiggly, and then they're really big trees. And I asked him about it. I said, are you going to dig those up? And he's like, oh, I think at this point I would need an excavator to get all those trees out. I'm not sure I'm going to get around to it. I've got enough to worry about. And the same thing happened with Jim up in Occidental. To some of the pines he was growing, they just kind of got away from him. So I feel like with this tree, that's almost what happened. I had it growing in the front yard for long enough that it almost got away from me, because I was not paying close enough attention. So ground growing can be great, but it can also be a little bit dangerous in the sense that you might lose control of the tree and end up with something a lot bigger than you thought you were going to get. And frankly, a lot of people, like when I'm teaching workshops and classes, will ask me, well, when you're developing stock, how do you know when it's big enough? Like, when do you stop it from getting bigger? And it's kind of subjective, but the way that I usually know that stock is big enough is that if you're going to start seeing features that you've created in the stock kind of fade away. In other words, if you've created movement in a trunk and the trunk has gotten so big that most of that movement is no longer visible, then you don't have as good a piece of stock as you started with, and you probably should have stopped that bulking of the trunk, a year or two or however many years prior to when you got to it. And I think that's kind of what happened with some of the material that Jim and I were looking at his place. So it's like, it could still potentially be a bonsai, but it's not as good of a bonsai at that point as it could have been if the growth had been stopped earlier. All right, now I feel like I'm just rambling.
No, it's good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How have you decided what kind of style you're going for with this?
Yeah, good question. I mean, so even back to the original design, and hopefully as I clean this up a little bit, you guys will sort of see that reemerging from the giant bush that we have here. What I was kind of going for was a relatively natural looking kind of clump of trees that was a very old raft. Now, I had seen in magazines and also in having gone to Japan, and I think here as well, a few imports of Korean hornbeams that have these really big bases and then kind of a sinuous raft off to one side. So they have a main trunk that has some really nice taper and branching on it, and then this very elegant raft going off. They also make the same style out of beech in certain, like if you pick up Kokofu books, you'll see them from time to time. So I think that's actually originally, oh, did my phone just die?
Maybe, or you got a text or something.
Okay, so you guys can still sort of see me.
Yeah.
I'll check it in a minute. I think that's what I was originally going for with this. And in the ground growing process, what I ended up with was very much more that kind of even trunk size. So in continuing to work with this particular piece of material, I think I will continue to try to differentiate the sizes of the trunks. So the two largest trunks, unfortunately, are not ideally positioned. This trunk, the part I have my finger on is smaller, but this trunk right here is one of the two larger ones. And then this trunk right here is one of the two largest ones. There's not a whole lot of visual logic to that. And I would really actually like to see this trunk, and this trunk, sort of the three central ones that are taller, also be the fattest ones. So to that end, I'm actually going to leave the sacrifice branch on these two. I already cut the other one, but I'm going to leave these guys a little bit longer to encourage these guys to bulk up a little bit more compared to the other smaller ones like this one. And I'll cut this one back. There's a funny kind of downside to developing trees like this sometimes, in the sense that when you simultaneously start the ramification process, like what I'm doing right now, while you're still trying to bulk up certain trunks, what ends up happening is over the years that I'm bulking this, I'll get like a nice little crown going on this, and this one won't have a crown on it for years afterwards because I was still working on the bulking of the trunk.
Oh.
And that can kind of perpetuate itself. So one of the things that I'm still looking for a solution for, in my own mind at least. If you guys have any suggestions, let me know. Let me check my phone.
Yeah, I think that is often just kind of the rub. You know, if you want to let something extend so that it gets bulk and gets fatter, then the internodes start getting so far apart. And then you wonder if maybe that's not going to matter because you're going to have to cut the thing back.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a kind of a process where things are kind of out of balance for so long when you're in the developing stage.
Has anybody else done a raft? Do you have any input as far as your experience? Ah, there you go.
I think that particular problem actually applies to not just raft style, but a lot of different styles. It's an interesting problem. I've had it come up where I end up having lower branches with much better ramification than the top of the tree, which is sort of kind of not the norm in terms of the way you see material developed. And it's not, it's not a horrible thing because crowns tend to develop a little bit more quickly than lower branches tend to. But it's just sort of an interesting thing to have as a side effect of that process.
It seems like some trees, like say for instance, if you have an azalea, they're real strong at the bottom, but not very strong at the top, just the opposite of the pine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, azaleas are well known for that. Like chojubai would be another example where they like to sucker from the bottom and making things that are taller, chojubai and other varieties of quince. And yeah, so then you're sort of having the opposite struggle, which is to control the vigor of the lower branches while trying to encourage the vigor of the upper branches. Just like one little piece of wire on there. All right, so I have a couple more cuts here, but like I said, I'm not going to completely cut this guy back because I want to let a couple of these run. This one has sort of taken off on its own without me noticing and is not part of what I want, so I'm going to take that off entirely. And then this guy over here, I don't know, you guys can kind of see this part has been wired up to about right here, and then it's taken off, cut that. So then it's taken off from that point with no wiring on it. So I'm going to cut it back, probably right about there. Now this trunk is one of the ones that's actually bigger than I want it to be, so I don't want that guy to run further with additional growth on the top. I want to keep it shorter. So I'm going to cut that back, just keep these smaller branches that are here. And these are the two, you can probably see it better on the other camera. So these are the two that I think where the trunks still need to be a little bit bigger. So I'm going to let those guys continue to run for a little while longer.
The trunk that you said was bigger than you wanted?
Yep.
How are you going to get that wound to heal? Or will it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So hornbeams are a little tough when it comes to wound healing. They don't kind of roll over as easily as some other deciduous species, and you'll see in bigger hornbeams, the scars take a really long time to heal over. With this particular one, and
Do you want me to change?
yeah, go back to the detail. So I've got it right here. So with this particular one, the new shoot here has, there we go. So the new shoot here has kind of come out on one side, and as you would expect, it's forming wood on kind of on this side. So these guys have a tendency to kind of make veining, not strictly like a juniper, but they don't have that sort of generalized growth around a wound. I don't see. So that being the wound, most of the wood formation from this vigorous shoot for an entire year is just right here, right? And there's actually a section right here where there's been no wood formation whatsoever. It looks like this has probably died back down into here a little ways. So what I'll need to do is I'll need to come back in and carve this out further down. And then without taking off the new wood that's formed right here, I'll probably carve this down as well until I get to a live bit of tissue, then reseal this, which it looks like I actually neglected to do in the first place, to encourage that to heal over the wound.
Okay.
So Eric, do you have a nursery, or is this at your private home just a kind of a collection of, I don't know, how many trees, or what's the situation?
Good question. So a little bit of both, and that's a really confusing answer, I'm sure. So up until the beginning of this year, I was only growing trees in my own yard and occasionally spilling over into maybe my neighbor's yard, or convincing a few friends to house some plants in their backyards here in the city or elsewhere. I also rented bench space from Jonas for a couple of years while I was remodeling. I had to move all of the trees out of my backyard for a year and a half while we were working on our house. But I bought a piece of property in the East Bay and started growing more trees over there. So I have a lot more trees than I used to, but many of them are very young, like these guys. So it'll be a while before these guys are sort of looking more like bonsai. But yeah, I'm working on a lot more trees than I used to be. Put it that way.
Interesting.
But you aren't quite ready for us to make our bus trip come to your place, huh?
I probably wouldn't. At this point, it probably would not be productive. But I will certainly let you know.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like if you, a lot of people are interested in seedlings, but for me, starting from the very beginning, from a seedling or a cutting, and having that adaptability, that sort of being able to mold the plant from the very early stages is something that I find allows for really great results. And having done it for over the course of more than 15 years, almost 20 years now, it's really exciting to see some of the things that you can do over the course of that kind of a time period. So I'm hoping that as I move forward, I can do it on a larger scale than what I've done so far, put it that way.
Are you open to hearing questions from members about their own trees if they have it?
Absolutely. I'm pretty much done with this, so you guys can fire away and I'll cut on this guy while we're talking and look at your pictures if you have them or video.
Yeah. So if anyone has any live shots or photos that they would like to share and get Eric's, or just a question for Eric about your trees, it's a good time to pick his brain.
Do you guys usually manage to do show and tell?
It varies via Zoom during our meetings, of course. People bring trees in, but we're still learning how to share our trees, and we also have our workshops once a month that for members to specifically come with questions with their trees and show their trees and all.
I have a question, comment.
Excellent.
So, and everybody in our club knows I have very limited knowledge of, or very limited potential, or pay attention to the cultivars. But I think I have a European hawthorn with red berries. I think that's what it is. Hedgerows in England.
Yeah.
And I got that at Moriyama's nursery because of the big red berry on it. And it's young enough that it's maybe a thumb size trunk, okay. But it's not going to be what you have in front of you while I'm still alive. But it isn't going to be good either as a upright tree. So I'm thinking, as I'm watching as you're motivating me to do that, I'm thinking, well, what if I lay that over and make multiple trunks out of it and throw those berries on it? Do you have knowledge of that type of a tree? Is it going to root okay? The wiring, of course, can work. So what about on a raft style? What about fruit? Because it throws the berry on this thing. It's not really a berry. It's about your thumbnail.
Yeah.
Size fruit.
Yeah. So I've worked with hawthorns a fair amount. That is what you said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've worked with hawthorns a fair amount, mostly of the English variety. There's a really great variety that Jay McDonald loves called Washington hawthorn. I actually don't know the botanical names, but the hawthorns I've worked with, you can air layer them. It's not a slam dunk. It's a little bit harder than some other species, but I would almost guarantee you that you can make a raft out of them. In fact, the person, I mentioned him earlier because it was one of the examples in the slideshow, Harry Harrington's website, Bonsai for Me, I think it's I'll just Google him, Harry Harrington Bonsai. I think it's beforme.com, but don't quote me on that. He is constantly, he's in England, and he's constantly working on hawthorns. A lot of really interesting, and I think he has more than one raft hawthorn. That said, I'm not sure that it's not, collected hedgerow kind of stuff that was already kind of raft shaped, and he's just sort of ramified them, cut them back and carved them and whatnot. So to your question about creating a raft like we've done here tonight, or like we've talked about, I think you should go for it. And one of the things I haven't mentioned is that I mentioned it sort of in passing when I was talking about the juniper. I usually work with, I don't know how these mics are working, if that one's over there and you guys can hear me.
I hear you fine.
I don't know what's going on. Anyway, the working with batches of trees is what I would encourage you to do. It represents more space, it represents more cost, but it will teach you things that working with one tree will not. And I would encourage you to go back to Mariama's, and I hardly know him, so I'm not trying to sell trees for him. But go buy 4 more of the same variety. I think if you had...
He only has 1 more. So I got the medium one. I was tempted to grab the big one, but I got the medium one. So, but it was just that red berry or piece of fruit. I should say piece of fruit. That red piece of fruit is just dynamic on that.
Well, take some cuttings or try some air layers. Try to propagate it so you have more than one to work with. The reason being that if you're only working with one plant of a particular variety and something happens to it, it's very difficult for you to know whether you did something wrong or whether something just happened to that plant that's going to be difficult to explain. Now, usually you can find an explanation for anything that will happen to a plant, but sometimes the explanation requires you to send things off to a pathology lab or get really sciencey about it. So the simpler and cheaper way to deal with problem solving when it comes to growing trees is to have batches at minimum like 3, but really I like to work with batches around 20. And the reason is that if you have 3 trees and one gets sick and the other 2 are fine, then you think to yourself like, well, okay, what's going on with this one? If you have 2 trees and one gets sick, you're a little bit less sure what's going on. Well, is it this one, or are they both going to get it? If you have 20 trees and one gets sick, then you're like, well, obviously something's going on with this and the rest of these are fine. So the point being that from a horticultural standpoint, the challenges that you face in terms of creating things, in terms of addressing problems, whether it's pest problems, fungal problems, anything like that, it's easier to troubleshoot if you have a number of the same species. So
good input and good lead on Harry Harrington or his site. So I'll follow that, especially if he's over there dealing with those specific trees on a regular basis. That will be advantageous, because I've not seen many of them around here. A Washington hawthorn I have, but me personally, I've not seen Washington hawthorns with big red fruits on them.
no,
Me though.
Yeah, the Washington thorns are more, the fall foliage is really great, like a really brilliant red, and nice small leaves and fine, fine twigging. So I think those are the more the characteristics. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen berries on them.
Okay.
I don't think I've seen one with berries on it.
Yeah, there's definitely berries, and one Washington thorn I had, I thought it was a thorn. I thought there was a lot of prickly thorns on it. And it was a long time ago, so that might be my bad memory. I'm old. I'm an old fat guy, so what can I say?
Oh, we're all working on it.
Good question. Anybody else have a question about one of their trees or anything that Eric has shared tonight?
It's been an excellent presentation. A few people have noticed that in sending me little chats saying how much they've enjoyed the presentation.
Well, good. I'm happy to stay on for a little while longer, but if you guys want to wrap it up, that'd be fine too. So I'll leave it up to you guys.
Well, last round. Are there any questions from anybody? It's been excellent. I've thought of a tree we have in our garden. Maybe we'll try it with. It was headed to the trash bin, so maybe it'll head to a different pot.
I do feel like it's inspirational. I have some little seedling kinds of things that I want to try immediately.
Yeah, give it a try.
Is this the right time to go ahead and do that? To take a seedling and plant it and
I think, okay, so crab apples are traditionally repotted in fall. I think it's a little bit of hooey, but there's something about the crown gall that crab apples
oh
contain,
yeah,
and the nematodes that hypothetically carry the bacteria that causes it. So I've never seen any real evidence of that, but that was one of the things I was thinking when I decided to repot the crabapple. But when you have a lot of plants, you repot out of season a lot. The safest time is probably to follow the same rules that you do with your bonsai in terms of transplanting. Do it in the off season between December and the end of February. But a lot of times, like with the younger juniper that I had up here a few minutes ago, you're not even really disturbing the root ball. You're kind of like just turning it sideways and sticking it into a giant box. You can do that anytime. It would just be if you were having to do invasive root work in order to reorient the tree that you would want to be a little bit more careful and do it at repotting time.
okay.
But would the effectiveness of the root hormone and getting the roots to start, wouldn't they occur more likely in spring?
When it's warmer?
You would certainly get good rooting in early spring. Interestingly, we get really good root movement in fall for some reason as well. I don't really understand why, but I've been repotting trees almost every day this year because I have a greenhouse that I put them in afterward, which sort of alleviates a lot of the problems, and most of them are seedlings, but it's been really interesting to see. There was a lot of spring root growth, like fresh roots when you're repotting trees, and then during summer, during the the middle months of summer, a lot less root growth. Even when plants are vigorously growing plants, a lot of them will have less root growth, and then as we move back into fall, a lot more root growth again. It's kind of it doesn't make sense to me in some way. Like I haven't kind of figured out why that is, but it seems to be the case that you get a flush of root growth in the fall.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been fabulous. I knew nothing about rafts myself prior, so this has been really good for me personally. I think think, if no one else has any more questions.
I have one more question,
Oh, excellent. Go ahead, Roger.
and I'll stop bugging you. So now we're talking, let's say your second or third tree in your raft that's there. And I've got this crabapple. This all hypothetical. So I have this crabapple that's about that size, but it just isn't working for me. I've got more trees than I need, and it's one of the things, all right, I need to make, I don't like this, but God, it has so much potential. I really like that. Make it better. And what if I tilt that over into a raft? But now we're talking about maybe a baseball, baseball, a little bit bigger than a baseball size root ball. So do I go all the way over at once, or do I and then cut that Namari that's up on top of there? Because most of the stuff you've done at a younger age.
Yeah.
So now we're talking about having the older age thing that I'd just soon not keep, but I can play with.
Yeah. So I would go ahead and give it a try, and I would. It's without seeing it, it's a bit of a judgment. It's a bit of a guess, I guess, instead of a judgment.
I don't see it yet either. It was imagination.
Yeah. So I can imagine that, like, two scenarios. One would be that you would just want to remove any roots that are sticking up. Do it during regular repotting time, and I would imagine you're not going to face too much of an issue with doing that. Essentially, if you're cutting off a third of the root ball, but keeping the majority of the root ball that ends up on the bottom side, the plant's still going to have plenty of roots to rely on. So that would be one scenario. The other is, if you get it out of the container and you're looking at the roots and something kind of hits you, you're looking at the roots and you're like, oh, it might be interesting if I did this, then maybe don't cut the roots off. So I'm always looking to the plant to be a source of to make suggestions, essentially.
Okay.
So if you find you have a piece of material that you don't like what you're saying, that's actually exactly what was going on with this when I started it as a raft. I had an informal upright. There was nothing about it that I found very interesting. It was a trunk the size of my thumb. It had been wired to create some movement, but in essence, it was just going to be this little informal upright, not a lot of good taper. And so I just thought, well, maybe I'll try this. And I just went whole hog. So I think you asked, should I do it all at once? My answer would definitely be yes. Get it all the way to the angle that you want. Unless that angle is above the soil line, like some of the examples we looked at. I mean, I've seen people do that with redwoods. Obviously, people have done it like Harry Harrington with hawthorns. And we saw a natural example of it. I think that was some type of conifer that was from Reddit. So creatively, it's up to you what you think the best use of the material is. And then beyond that point, just sort of see what the tree gives you.
Then horticulturally, would you sphagnum moss or something like that root ball, since let's suggest we're going to eliminate it ultimately. Would you wrap that for the safety of the tree originally, or we just knock it out of there and let the other 60% of the root or 50% of the root that you did properly bury, carry it forward?
I would treat it just like any other repotting in the sense that if you have a freshly cut roots that are exposed above the soil line, you would want to cover those in sphagnum moss just to ease the transition, or make a mound of soil and sphagnum moss, whatever you think is appropriate, whatever you normally do for a tree where there's a little bit of sort of doubt about the exposure of the root ball. Because ultimately, whether or not you remove the original root ball will depend on where you go with the composition. You might decide that you want to keep it. So I would kind of, at each stage, evaluate what you have. and leave your options open until the point where you make a decision that that's what you want to do.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I don't have a single raft, but I'll have a couple before the next pot within the potting season. It was a good presentation and motivated me to at least have one or two.
Yep, I agree. It was very, very, very good, Eric. Really enjoyed it a lot.
Yep, we knew he'd be inspirational as soon as we saw that creative demonstration that he had.
Yeah,
That piece with
that was
the,
amazing.
we're calling it a raft, the surfboard, kayak. Yep.
That was great. It was very well done, Eric. And I think we'll probably wind it up at this point. Very good explanation. And it was wonderful. So.
All right. I'll drop off. It'll take me a minute because I've got two cameras, but thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it, everyone, and have a good night.
You too. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night to everybody. Be safe.
Good night.
Enjoy your bonsai and be healthy.
Night all.
Good night. Take care.
Take it to the desktop.